Horses pulled wagons loaded with injured students to makeshift hospitals. The scene was chaos, grief, and disbelief all at once. But Kehoe was not finished. While rescuers worked frantically, he drove his explosives-laden truck to the school grounds. He stepped out, carrying a rifle, and waved over the superintendent, Emery Hike, with whom he had often quarreled. Witnesses later recalled Kehoe smiling faintly as if pleased that his plan had worked, and then, in an instant, he detonated the truck. The explosion was so powerful it sent metal fragments flying hundreds of feet. Shrapnel tore through rescuers, parents, and children alike. Superintendent Huick was killed instantly, along with Kehoe himself and several others nearby. Flames engulfed the twisted wreckage, and bodies lay scattered across the schoolyard. Survivors screamed for loved ones, many of whom would never answer. By midday, the scale of the disaster was clear. 38 children and 6 adults were dead, with more than 50 others injured. The numbers were staggering, especially for a farming community where everyone knew each other. Some families lost multiple children in a single instant. The Bath school disaster would stand for decades as the worst mass killing at a school in U.S. history. As investigators picked through the ruins, they made a chilling discovery. In the south wing of the school, untouched by the blast, they found more than 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite and pyrotol, wired and ready. For reasons no one could explain, the second charge had failed to ignite. If it had, the entire building would have been obliterated, and the death toll would have been far higher. Reporters descended on Bath Township, their headlines capturing the horror, but struggling to explain Kehoe's motives. Some called him insane, others a cold-blooded killer consumed by hate. On his farm, investigators found his final message: a wooden sign nailed to a fence post with the words, "Criminals are made, not born." It was a cryptic, bitter farewell, suggesting Kehoe blamed the world for shaping him into what he had become. The community buried its children in waves of funerals that stretched on for days. Coffins were lowered into the ground while mothers and fathers wept quietly, their grief too deep for words. Ministers spoke of faith. Neighbors clutched each other for comfort. But nothing could erase the image of the schoolhouse rubble or the screams that had pierced the spring air. In the aftermath, questions lingered. Could anyone have stopped Kehoe? Signs of his bitterness had been obvious. His rants about taxes, his angry outbursts. But no one could have imagined he would turn that anger into mass murder. Psychologists later examined his actions as a case study in obsessive rage, noting how his financial ruin, his wife's illness, and his grievances against authority had coalesced into a single catastrophic act of revenge. The Bath school disaster reshaped the way communities thought about safety. In its wake, towns reconsidered access to explosives, and schools became places of unease rather than unquestioned refuge. But over time, the memory of Bath faded from national consciousness, overshadowed by newer tragedies. For the families who lived through it, however, the scars never disappeared. Survivors carried stories of that day into old age, recalling how they heard the walls collapse, how they saw classmates crushed, how their childhood ended in a single morning of terror. Nearly a century later, Bath remains a haunting reminder of what unchecked bitterness and vengeance can unleash. In the stillness of rural Michigan, where fields stretch under open skies, the ghosts of May 18, 1927 linger. The site of the school is now marked by a memorial, a granite stone etched with the names of the children who died. Visitors place flowers there, whispering prayers for children whose lives ended far too soon. The Bath School massacre was not just an act of violence. It was a deliberate, calculated destruction carried out by a man who believed the world had wronged him. In the end, he punished not those responsible for his suffering, but the most innocent and vulnerable members of his community. It is a story that reveals the darkest edge of human resentment and a tragedy that continues to echo through history, reminding us how fragile the boundary is between ordinary life and unspeakable horror. On January 17, 1989, the children of Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California, spilled into the playground for their morning recess. The air was cool, the sun cutting through the winter haze, and the chatter of nearly 300 students filled the schoolyard. Most of the children were refugees from Southeast Asia, Cambodian, Laotian, and Vietnamese families who had fled war and violence overseas in search of peace in America. They carried with them the scars of displacement, but on that morning, they were simply children playing on swings, chasing each other across asphalt, and laughing in the brief escape from their classrooms. At 11:40 a.m., that sense of safety was shattered by a barrage of gunfire that lasted less than 5 minutes, but would leave an indelible mark on American history. The man behind the shooting was Patrick Purdy, a 24-year-old drifter whose life was defined by instability, resentment, and hatred. Purdy had a history of petty crime, substance abuse, and mental health struggles. He had moved from job to job, town to town, leaving behind a trail of violence and despair. His hatred, however, crystallized around two fixations: resentment toward immigrants whom he blamed for his own failures, and a belief that America's schools were symbols of the country's decline. He carried his anger like a manifesto, scribbling racist phrases into notebooks and nurturing the conviction that children of immigrant families represented the erosion of his imagined America. In the days leading up to the attack, Purdy purchased an AK-47 style semi-automatic rifle along with hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He painted the weapon with slogans such as freedom and victory, a twisted irony considering what he planned to do with it. He also bought a pistol, smoke grenades, and firecrackers as if preparing for a war. To him, the battlefield would be a schoolyard filled with children. That morning, Purdy drove to Cleveland Elementary. He parked near the school, donned camouflage clothing, and armed himself. Teachers noticed him briefly, but there was no time to react. At 11:40, he strode onto the playground, raised his rifle, and opened fire. The first bursts of gunfire sent children screaming in every direction. Bullets tore across the asphalt, striking bodies in rapid succession. Some children fell instantly. Others tried desperately to reach the doors of the school. Teachers rushed outside, yelling for their students to get down, some throwing themselves over children to shield them. The playground, once alive with laughter, became a scene of chaos and bloodshed. Purdy fired more than 100 rounds in under 4 minutes. He methodically swept the rifle across the yard, targeting the fleeing children. 5 were killed instantly, all between the ages of 6 and 9. Nearly 30 others were wounded, many critically. The majority of victims were children of Southeast Asian refugees. Survivors later recalled the horrifying sounds of gunfire, the cries of their classmates, and the sight of bodies lying motionless on the ground. When his magazine was empty, Purdy drew his pistol, placed it to his own head, and pulled the trigger. In an instant, the gunfire stopped, leaving behind only screams or sirens and the heavy silence of shock. Police and emergency crews arrived within minutes. They found a playground littered with backpacks, lunchboxes, and the small shoes of children who had fled in terror. Blood stained the pavement. Teachers clutched sobbing students, some of whom were in shock and unable to speak. Ambulances rushed the injured to local hospitals while parents raced to the school, frantic for news of their children. The death toll, 5 children killed, 29 others wounded, was devastating. For a refugee community that had already endured war, genocide, and displacement, the massacre was a cruel repetition of trauma. Parents who had fled the killing fields of Cambodia or the bombings of Laos now stood outside an American school mourning children who had died in what was supposed to be their sanctuary. Investigators pieced together Purdy's troubled life. He had grown up in a broken home, shuffled through foster care, and carried a criminal record for robbery, assault, and weapons charges. He drifted between jobs and towns, often homeless, often intoxicated. He had also been evaluated for mental health issues, but never received consistent treatment. His hatred toward immigrants, particularly Asian communities, grew out of his failures. He saw them as scapegoats for his inability to succeed. In his twisted logic, striking at their children in a schoolyard was a way to make a statement. The Stockton schoolyard shooting horrified the nation. Images of small bodies being carried from the playground, of weeping parents clutching photographs, and of blood-streaked classrooms flashed across television screens. The scale of the violence, coupled with the youth of the victims, ignited a national debate on gun control. In the weeks after the shooting, lawmakers introduced new measures targeting assault weapons. California quickly passed a ban on semi-automatic rifles like the one Purdy had used, becoming the first state to enact such legislation. The massacre also influenced the federal government, though it would take years. The Stockton tragedy was a pivotal moment in shaping conversations about access to high-powered firearms. But beyond politics, the community of Stockton was left to bury its children. Vigils were held, candles flickering against the night sky as parents wept openly, some collapsing into the arms of strangers. Funerals for the 5 children were devastating. Tiny coffins lowered into the earth, siblings clutching flowers, and parents unable to comprehend how safety had dissolved in a single schoolyard. Teachers who had shielded their students became local heroes, though many carried deep trauma from the attack. Some left the profession altogether, unable to walk back into classrooms without reliving the gunfire. Survivors, both children and adults, would carry scars, both visible and invisible, for decades. Many of the Southeast Asian families struggled with survivors' guilt, haunted by the irony of fleeing war only to face violence again in their adopted homeland. Purdy's motives remained a chilling reminder of how personal failures untreated mental illness and extremist beliefs can combine into catastrophic violence. His final act, ending his life, ensured that he would never face trial or provide answers. His written ramblings left behind only fragments of hate, none of which could explain why the lives of innocent children had to be destroyed. The Stockton shooting became a grim turning point in America's awareness of mass shootings at schools. It was not the first, and it would not be the last, but its scale and brutality marked it as a national tragedy. It showed that no community, not even a playground filled with laughter, was immune to the reach of violence. Decades later, survivors still recall the sound of gunfire echoing across the blacktop, the image of classmates falling beside them, and the moment when childhood ended abruptly. For them, January 17th, 1989, is not history. It is a memory that lives in every scar, every nightmare, every empty chair at family gatherings. The Cleveland Elementary School building was eventually closed and demolished, replaced with a park. A memorial stands nearby, etched with the names of the children who died that morning. Visitors leave flowers, toys, and prayers, remembering the 5 young lives stolen by hatred and gunfire. The Stockton Schoolyard Massacre is a story of innocence destroyed, of families forced to relive trauma, and of a community forever marked by a single man's rage. It is a haunting reminder that violence can strike even in places meant for safety and joy, and that the scars of such attacks do not fade with time, but live on in the hearts of those left behind. On the morning of March 11th, 2009, the town of Winnenden, nestled in the state of Baden-Württemberg, Germany, stirred awake under gray skies. Albertville Realschule, a secondary school serving about 600 students, opened its doors as it had countless times before. Teenagers filed into classrooms, teachers prepared lessons, and the hum of ordinary school life filled the halls. No one could have predicted that within hours the building would be drenched in terror, as a former student returned not to learn, but to kill. The attacker was 17-year-old Tim Kretschmer. To his parents and neighbors, Tim was unremarkable, quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but hardly the type one would expect to unleash violence. But beneath the surface, he was a troubled young man. He suffered from depression, social isolation, and an overwhelming sense of failure. He had been treated at a psychiatric clinic for mood disorders, but he resisted therapy, often cutting sessions short or refusing to participate. Tim's struggles were compounded by shame and resentment. He had left Albertville Realschule the year before without graduating, a humiliation that festered. His life at home was no better. He clashed with his father, who kept a collection of firearms. Among them was a Beretta 9mm pistol, which Tim would eventually steal. In the early hours of March 11th, Tim dressed in black and armed himself with the pistol and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He slipped out of his parents' home, leaving behind a family unaware of what was about to unfold. By 9:30 a.m., he arrived at his old school. He walked calmly through the doors, blending in with the morning flow until he drew his weapon. His first shots rang out in a classroom on the upper floor. Without warning, he fired at a group of students and their teacher. Panic exploded instantly. Screams echoed down the corridors, chairs overturned, and students scrambled under desks or toward exits. In just minutes, Tim killed 9 people inside the school 8 students, mostly young girls, and 1 teacher. Many victims were shot at close range, unable to escape the sudden violence. Teachers locked classroom doors, huddling students inside while alarms rang. Some students leapt from windows to escape, breaking bones but surviving. Others called parents on their cell phones, whispering goodbyes or frantic pleas for help. The police response was swift, with armed units rushing to the scene within minutes. But Tim had already slipped out of the building, leaving chaos and blood in his wake. Outside, he shot 2 more people as he fled. He carjacked a vehicle, ordering the driver to keep moving while he reloaded. The man later recalled the killer's chilling calm, how he spoke as though this were inevitable, how he seemed detached from the devastation he had left behind. The manhunt sprawled across the region. Police tracked Tim as he moved from town to town, firing at officers and civilians. In the suburb of Vendlingen, about 25 miles from Winnenden, the standoff reached its climax. Tim engaged police in a firefight near a car dealership, wounding officers before turning the gun on himself. At 12:30 p.m., less than 3 hours after the first shots at Albertville Realschule, Tim Kretschmer was dead. The final toll was staggering. 15 lives lost, including 9 students, 3 teachers, and 3 bystanders, with many others wounded. The scale of the carnage stunned Germany, a country not accustomed to school shootings of this magnitude. In the aftermath, investigators pieced together Tim's life. His computer contained violent video games and disturbing searches about school massacres. He had expressed suicidal thoughts in online chats and hinted at plans for violence, though no one took his words seriously enough to raise alarms. The pistol he used belonged to his father, who kept it inadequately secured despite laws requiring strict storage. For this, his father would later face criminal charges, accused of negligence that enabled the massacre. The nation mourned. Vigils were held in Winnenden, where thousands gathered in silence, holding candles as church bells tolled. Flowers piled up outside the school, where bloodstains still marked the hallways. Parents clutched photographs of their children, faces frozen in smiles that would never age. The funerals were devastating. Coffins lined church aisles, small ones and large, each a reminder of a future stolen. Communities that once bustled with everyday routine were consumed by grief. Teachers wept openly, unable to reconcile the violence with the students they had taught only hours before. Survivors struggled with trauma, replaying the moments when gunfire rang out, when classmates fell, when they ran for their lives. For Germany, the Winnenden shooting became a catalyst for debate about mental health, youth violence, and gun control. Questions swirled. How could a teenager with a documented history of depression obtain such easy access to a deadly weapon? Could psychiatric intervention have prevented his descent? Should stricter gun laws be enforced to protect against future tragedies? Lawmakers moved quickly. Regulations tightened on firearm storage and licensing, with increased inspections to ensure compliance. Schools were urged to improve emergency protocols, and conversations about youth mental health grew louder. Yet for many, policy changes offered little comfort. The wounds in Winnenden ran too deep. Survivors carried those wounds into adulthood. Some would struggle with survivor's guilt, haunted by the knowledge that they lived while friends did not. Others developed anxiety, unable to step into classrooms or crowded places without flashbacks. Families of the dead endured a void that could never be filled, their homes forever quieted by absence. Tim's motives remained both clear and elusive. His resentment toward his school, his struggles with depression, and his fascination with violence all played a role, but none of those factors could fully explain the enormity of his actions, the choice to turn his pain outward to destroy lives rather than seek help. The story of Winnenden is one of innocence betrayed. A school meant to foster growth and opportunity became a place of terror. Children who had already carried the weight of adolescence were forced to confront mortality in the most brutal way. Teachers who had dedicated their lives to education became targets. Years later, a memorial was erected in Winnenden, a circle of 15 stone chairs, each representing a victim, each empty to symbolize the lives cut short. Families gather there on anniversaries, lighting candles and whispering prayers, their grief both personal and collective. Visitors walk the circle, reading the names and imagining the children who once filled classrooms with laughter. The Winnenden school shooting left scars, not only on a town but on a nation. It forced Germany to confront the vulnerabilities within its schools, its laws, and its systems of care, and it remains a haunting reminder that despair, when combined with access to weapons and unresolved rage, can transform into destruction on an unimaginable scale. In the end, Winnenden is remembered not only for its tragedy, but also for its silence. The silence of classrooms left empty, of futures erased, and of a community struggling to understand how one of its own could inflict such devastation. The echoes of gunfire may have faded, but the absence left behind still lingers, a shadow over a town that will never forget March 11th, 2009. On September 1st, 2004, the city of Beslan in North Ossetia, Russia, awoke to celebration. It was the day of knowledge, the traditional first day of the school year. At school number 1, children carried flowers for teachers, parents held cameras, and teachers prepared speeches. The air was alive with laughter and anticipation, the kind of joy that marks new beginnings. But within hours, that joy would turn into one of the darkest tragedies in modern history. A school siege that lasted 3 days claimed over 330 lives and left scars so deep that they are felt to this day. At around 9 a.m., as families gathered for the opening ceremony, a group of heavily armed militants stormed the school. They carried automatic weapons, explosives, and grenades. Shouting orders, they fired into the air and herded more than 1,100 hostages, students, parents, and teachers into the gymnasium. Panic erupted. Mothers screamed, children cried, and teachers tried desperately to shield their students. The attackers quickly rigged the gym with explosives. Wires crisscrossed above the terrified crowd, bombs dangling precariously. Some were strapped to basketball hoops, others to the ceiling. The message was clear: one wrong move and everyone would die. Armed guards stood watch, weapons ready. Escape seemed impossible. Outside, chaos reigned. Police surrounded the school, but they were hesitant to act. No one knew how many hostages were inside or what the militants demanded. The group, later identified as Chechen and Ingush separatists, declared their purpose. They wanted Russia to withdraw troops from Chechnya. Their method was to hold innocent children hostage to force the government's hand. Inside the gym, conditions quickly deteriorated. Families were denied food and water. The September heat turned the room into an oven, and the captives were forbidden from opening windows. Children fainted from dehydration, and parents resorted to desperate measures, some collecting urine in bottles to moisten their children's lips. The militants were ruthless. They executed some men immediately to assert control. They separated mothers from older boys, fearing that the boys might resist. One mother was forced to leave her crying infant behind because the baby made too much noise. The gym became a chamber of fear, where time seemed frozen, and every second was shadowed by death. For 3 days, the siege dragged on, negotiations faltered, with authorities unwilling to yield to demands. Outside, anxious parents clutched photographs of their children, begging for answers, praying for miracles. The world watched, horrified, as television broadcasts relayed the standoff. Inside, desperation grew. Children whispered prayers, teachers tried to keep them calm, and parents comforted them with lies of reassurance. It will be over soon. Some children drew pictures in the dust on the floor, houses, flowers, suns, dreaming of the outside world they might never see again. On the third day, September 3rd, the fragile tension shattered. Around 1:04 p.m., 2 powerful explosions ripped through the gymnasium. To this day, it remains unclear whether the bombs were triggered deliberately or detonated by accident. The blasts tore through the packed room, igniting fires and collapsing parts of the roof. Chaos erupted. Hostages surged toward broken windows and doors, desperate to escape. Militants opened fire, mowing down fleeing families. Russian special forces stormed the building, exchanging gunfire with the attackers. The school became a battlefield, bullets whizzing, flames roaring, children screaming. Parents outside rushed forward, some running into the burning school to pull out survivors with their bare hands. They carried scorched, bleeding children in their arms, sprinting past gunfire in a frantic race to save lives. The scene was apocalyptic, smoke billowing, bodies strewn across the ground, soldiers shouting orders as the school crumbled into ruin. By evening, the siege was over. Most of the militants were dead. A few were captured, but the human cost was staggering. More than 330 hostages were killed, including 186 children. Hundreds more were wounded. The gymnasium floor was littered with tiny shoes, backpacks, and charred remains. Survivors stumbled out in shock, their faces ash-streaked and hollow with terror. The aftermath was one of grief and fury. Funerals filled the town with lines of small coffins carried through the streets. Entire families were wiped out. Survivors described scenes of unimaginable horror. Children dying in their mothers' arms, siblings separated in the chaos, fathers shot while shielding their children. The Russian government faced fierce criticism. Many accused authorities of mishandling the siege, of being unprepared, and of storming the school too aggressively. Questions lingered. Could more lives have been saved? Did negotiations fail too soon? Why was intelligence ignored before the attack? For the people of Beslan, answers offered little comfort. The town became a symbol of tragedy, its name forever tied to the massacre. Survivors carried lifelong scars, both physical and psychological. Many children who lived through the siege grew up with post-traumatic stress, haunted by memories of thirst, fire, and death. Parents struggled with guilt. Those who survived often wished they hadn't, unable to bear the weight of loss. A memorial now stands at the site of school number 1. The ruined gymnasium remains preserved, its broken walls covered in photographs of the dead, its floor scattered with toys and flowers left by visitors. Each name carved into stone is a reminder of a life stolen too soon. On anniversaries, families gather in silence, releasing white balloons into the sky, one for every child who never came home. The Beslan school siege remains one of the most devastating school tragedies in history, not only for the sheer number of victims, but also for the cruelty inflicted. It was not a random act of violence, but a calculated terror that targeted children, the most vulnerable. For the world, Beslan was a chilling lesson in the cost of extremism, the fragility of safety, and the unbearable price paid by the innocent. For the survivors and families, it is a wound that will never fully heal, a memory of 3 days in September when childhood joy was replaced by fire, fear, and mourning. May 18, 1927 began like any other spring morning in the rural town of Bath Township, Michigan. Farmers prepared their fields, children dressed for school, and parents went about their daily routines. The Bath Consolidated School, a proud symbol of progress in the community, stood at the center of it all. It was new, modern, and meant to represent a brighter future for the children of Bath. But that morning, the promise of education would be violently torn apart in an act so monstrous that it remains the deadliest school massacre in American history. The man behind it was Andrew Kehoe, a 55-year-old school board treasurer. Outwardly, Kehoe was known as intelligent and meticulous. He lived with his wife Nellie on a farm where neighbors described him as hard-working but also cold, difficult, and prone to anger. Beneath his calm exterior brewed resentment toward rising taxes, toward the school board, and toward a world he believed had turned against him. Kehoe had long struggled with financial problems. His farm was mortgaged, and he had fallen behind on payments. On top of this, his wife was chronically ill, requiring medical care that drained their resources. Instead of seeking solutions, Kehoe turned his bitterness outward. He blamed the new consolidated school for increasing taxes and saw it as the source of his financial ruin. For months, Kehoe plotted revenge. He purchased explosives, pyritol, dynamite, and blasting caps, and under the guise of needing them for farm work, methodically he smuggled them into the school, hiding the materials in the basement and crawl spaces. Piece by piece, he wired the building with deadly precision. His plan was meticulous, horrifying in its scope, and designed to inflict maximum death. On the morning of May 18th, Kehoe put his plan into motion. He first murdered his wife, Nellie, beating her and setting fire to their farmhouse. Neighbors rushed to the scene, shocked by the flames consuming the Kehoe property. They had no idea it was only the beginning of a far greater horror. At 8:45 a.m., as classes began at Bath Consolidated School, an explosion ripped through the north wing. The blast was deafening, shattering windows, tearing through walls, and hurling children and teachers into the air. The roof collapsed in a roar of smoke and fire. Parents and townsfolk, alerted by the explosion, rushed to the school, only to be greeted by scenes of carnage. Children's bodies crushed under rubble, injured students crying out for help, and panicked survivors scrambling for safety. The town descended into chaos. Men dug through the wreckage with their bare hands, lifting beams and bricks in a desperate attempt to free trapped children. Mothers screamed as they searched for their sons and daughters, their voices cracking in despair. Ambulances from nearby towns raced in, but the devastation was overwhelming. As rescuers worked frantically, another explosion erupted outside. Kehoe himself arrived at the scene in his truck, which was packed with dynamite and shrapnel. Smiling, he waved people over, then detonated the truck. The blast killed Kehoe instantly, along with several others, including the school superintendent, Emery Hike. Children who had survived the first explosion were torn apart in the second. The crowd screamed as smoke and dust billowed across the schoolyard. In the aftermath, investigators discovered the full scale of Kehoe's plan. Inside the school, over 500 pounds of additional explosives had been planted, but for reasons still unknown, they failed to detonate. Had they gone off, the entire school would have been obliterated, and the death toll would have been even more catastrophic. When the smoke cleared, 38 children and 6 adults were dead. Dozens more were injured. The small town of Bath, population barely over 300, was devastated. Almost every family lost someone. Coffins lined the streets in the days that followed, and funerals became a grim ritual repeated again and again. The horror of the Bath school disaster shocked the nation. Newspapers carried the story across America, describing in detail the monstrous betrayal of a man entrusted with caring for the very institution he destroyed. Communities everywhere mourned for Bath, sending donations and letters of support. President Calvin Coolidge personally expressed his condolences, and the state of Michigan pledged to rebuild. The question on everyone's mind was why? Why would Andrew Kehoe commit such an atrocity? Investigators found little more than bitterness and financial ruin to explain his actions. He left behind chilling words: "Criminals are made, not born." It's all, but his statement gave no comfort. His meticulous planning, his willingness to target children, and his decision to destroy his own wife before striking the school painted a picture of a man consumed by rage and revenge. For Bath Township, the disaster left scars that never truly healed. Survivors carried trauma for the rest of their lives. Many who had been children that day grew up with survivor's guilt, haunted by the screams and the smoke. Parents who buried their children struggled to find meaning in the senseless loss. The town rebuilt the school, but the memory of the massacre hung over it like a shadow. Today, a memorial stands in Bath to honor the victims. It lists the names of the 44 people killed, most of them children. Visitors come to read the names, to remember the lives cut short, and to reflect on the fragility of safety in even the most ordinary places. The Bath school disaster remains a haunting reminder of how anger, resentment, and unchecked hatred can erupt into unimaginable violence. In a town where education was meant to symbolize hope, one man turned that promise into ashes forever, etching Bath into history as the site of the deadliest school massacre America has ever known. April 20th, 1999 began as an ordinary Tuesday in the suburban community of Littleton, Colorado. Columbine High School buzzed with the sounds of teenagers filling hallways, swapping jokes, and preparing for another day of classes. Students carried textbooks, chatted about weekend plans, and navigated the shifting rhythms of adolescence. It was a picture of American normalcy, but beneath the surface, two of their classmates had been planning something that would shatter not only their school, but also the nation's sense of security. Eric Harris, 18, and Dylan Klebold, 17, were not ordinary students. For over a year, they had meticulously planned an assault on their own school, compiling journals, videotapes, and blueprints. They stockpiled weapons, sawed-off shotguns, rifles, and homemade explosives. Their plan was to rival the most notorious acts of violence in history. To them, it was not just a school shooting, but an orchestrated attack meant to cause maximum destruction. At 11:19 a.m., their plan began. Dressed in trench coats, they walked toward the school's west entrance. Hidden beneath the coats were their weapons. They carried duffel bags filled with propane bombs, which they had planted earlier in the cafeteria. If the bombs had detonated, they would have killed hundreds of students instantly, but the devices failed. Undeterred, Harris and Klebold began shooting. Their first victims were outside, sitting near the school entrance. 17-year-old Rachel Scott was shot and killed instantly. Nearby, Richard Castaldo was critically wounded. Students screamed and scattered as gunfire echoed across the school grounds. Harris and Klebold moved inside, entering the library at 11:29 a.m. What followed was 12 minutes of terror. The library, filled with students hiding under desks, became the epicenter of the massacre. Harris and Klebold laughed and taunted their victims, asking them questions before pulling the trigger. They killed 10 students there, methodically moving through rows of tables. The sounds of gunfire, screams, and shouts of defiance filled the air. The shooters filmed themselves in previous weeks, describing their hatred for classmates and their desire to become infamous. That day, they lived out their twisted fantasies. Meanwhile, chaos unfolded outside. Police arrived quickly but hesitated to storm the building, unsure of the number of shooters or the scale of the attack. Parents rushed to the scene, some running toward the school, desperate for news. Television crews gathered, broadcasting live images of terrified students climbing out of windows, their hands raised in surrender. America watched in real time as the horror of Columbine unfolded. At 12:08 p.m., Harris and Klebold turned their guns on themselves in the library, ending the attack. In just under an hour, they had killed 13 people, 12 students and 1 teacher, and wounded more than 20 others. The cafeteria bombs, which failed to explode, could have multiplied the death toll many times over. The aftermath was devastating. The nation struggled to process the brutality of the massacre. Columbine became a symbol of a new kind of terror, mass shootings in schools. Before 1999, the phrase school shooting was not part of America's daily vocabulary. After Columbine, it became a haunting fixture. Stories from survivors painted a picture of both horror and heroism. Teacher Dave Sanders, who guided students to safety before being shot, bled to death, waiting for rescue. Student Cassie Bernal, allegedly asked about her faith before being killed, became a national symbol, though later accounts complicated the narrative. Others survived by playing dead, hiding in closets, or fleeing through broken windows. Each story revealed the randomness of survival and the cruelty of fate. The investigation into Harris and Klebold's motives uncovered a labyrinth of anger, alienation, and obsession. Their journals spoke of hatred for humanity, fantasies of destruction, and desires for revenge against classmates they despised. Yet they were not simply bullied outsiders, as early reports suggested. They had friends, attended parties, and blended into the student body. Their massacre was not a spontaneous act of revenge, but a calculated plan to leave a legacy of terror. In the years that followed, Columbine reshaped America's approach to school safety and law enforcement. Police tactics changed. No longer would officers wait outside during an active shooter situation. Schools implemented lockdown drills, security cameras, and stricter policies on threats. The phrase active shooter entered the lexicon, but beyond policy, Columbine became a cultural watershed, inspiring debates about gun laws, bullying, video games, and mental health. For the community of Littleton, the grief was immeasurable. Funerals for the victims stretched over days with thousands attending. White crosses lined a nearby hill, each bearing a victim's name. Survivors carried scars, both visible and invisible. Parents who lost children struggled with unanswerable questions: why their child, why their school, why that day. Columbine's shadow extended far beyond Colorado. Around the world, copycat attacks were attempted, and some succeeded, by individuals who idolized Harris and Klebold. Their writings and videos were dissected by investigators, scholars, and even future perpetrators, making the massacre a dark template for violence. To this day, Columbine remains a reference point in discussions of school shootings, symbolizing the moment innocence in the classroom was irrevocably shattered. Yet alongside the horror, there was resilience. Survivors rebuilt their lives, forming support groups, advocacy organizations, and memorial foundations. The Columbine Memorial, opened in 2007, stands as a place of reflection, with inscriptions from victims' families and words of hope amid tragedy. For the community, healing has been long and incomplete, but it continues. Columbine was not the first school shooting in America, but it was the one that defined a generation. It forced parents to view schools not only as places of learning, but also as potential targets. It exposed the fragility of safety, the complexity of motives behind such violence, and the devastating consequences of unchecked anger. On April 20th, each year, candles are lit, names are spoken, and memories are honored. The victims' bright, young lives and a teacher devoted to his students are remembered not for how they died, but for who they were. But the questions Columbine raised still echo. What drives young men to slaughter their classmates? And how can a society stop it from happening again? For those who lived through it, Columbine was not just a headline, but a day that divided life into before and after. For the world, it was a wake-up call that the walls of a school could not always protect the children inside. It was and remains a story of horror hidden in plain sight until it erupted in gunfire that forever changed the meaning of a normal school day.